I'm Greg Lobanov. I'm an indie game designer. I have made a game called Wandersong that came out in 2018, and I'm finishing a game right now called Chicory, A Colorful Tale, which is coming out this year in 2021. And I'm here today to talk in LudoNarraCon about a subject that is very important to me. Here's where all the budget for the talk went. We're going to talk about solving impossible design with storytelling. Woohoo! So this talk is kind of a response to another talk that was given a couple years ago at GDC by Alex Jaffe, who's a designer at Riot. The subject of the talk is cursed problems in game design. It's a really interesting talk. I recommend it to anybody. But I'm going to let Alex explain that idea in his own words.
Definition: it is an unsolvable design problem rooted in a conflict between core player promises. You're going to see this slide a lot. So it's basically anytime I'm trying to solve a design problem, and I have implicitly or explicitly promised two things that cannot coexist.
There you go. So part of the premise of his talk is that these kinds of cursed problems are impossible to solve. Like they present a conflict that literally there is no way to give the player both of those things, and therefore you kind of create, there's a design problem that cannot be solved. And he talks about a lot of actually really interesting examples, but one example that he specifically talks about that is personally interesting to me is games about creativity. So examples might be games like The Sims or Animal Crossing. In these kinds of games, ostensibly part of the big selling point of these games, like what they kind of put in their trailers and what they kind of sells the experience of the game is that players are meant to be creative in them. So it's all about building your house and making your perfect little Sims neighborhood, or collecting furniture and putting together your perfect island, and who's going to live on your island, and all these kinds of questions. But these games also have kind of systems in them that kind of actually drive the player's progression through the game, right? The actual goals to them. And I'm going to let the big man, Alex, talk about where he sees problems fundamentally with these types of games. So, Alex, please. If the YouTube video will load.
This is the problem, is players see a game like this, they want to express themselves, the game clearly signals they should, but the game also wants to draw them in with goals. And that ends up making players want to progress their character, or whatever form the progression takes. And these things are in conflict because expressing yourself involves following intrinsic goals, kind of like following your heart, basically. And progressing your character involves following extrinsic goals, doing what the game says you should do. And it's pretty well known that extrinsic goals tend to subsume intrinsic goals, right? The more time I spend focusing on getting those carrots, the less I really care about what I came for in the first place. It's just kind of seems to be a rule of thumb in games and in life. So these two things don't go together. The problem is cursed.
So, obviously, the games that he's talking about, they're super successful games. It's not to say that they aren't good. But I think there is some accuracy in his judgment of the way that, these kind of principles can come into conflict. They're definitely true to my experience. And I see flavors of this, honestly, in lots of other kinds of games. One, just a really common example that this video kind of really surfaces is, about clothing in RPGs. Lots of RPGs, they give you clothes that look different.
So, you finally arrived. What the hell are you wearing?
It's my ass-kicking outfit, bitch!
Ostensibly, right, you're supposed to care about how your character looks. You make choices, in fashionable ways, but then if the clothing have stats, then of course you're going to wear the clothes that give your character the best stats to actually help you get through the game, right? And so you always end up with characters that just look wacky because you don't actually care about whether they match or whatever, right? I think this is a super, super common problem. And even in games like The Sims or Animal Crossing, again, amazing games that I don't want to say aren't good, but there definitely is some feeling of for example, in The Sims, a lot of players will start out building out a house that's they're, whatever, they have, you always come in with visions of wanting to be creative, do whatever you want, but then to actually progress in the game, right, you have to advance your Sims career. You kind of get lost in the kind of weeds of day-to-day getting to their job right and optimizing which things there are in their house and which furniture and getting things to keep their meters high, and then by the time you actually advance their career to the highest level, it's you've kind of forgotten about the whole part of the game that got you excited in the first place, which is building your house and seeing the Sims alive in there. And for me, Animal Crossing had a really similar experience where it's like really exciting to get like all this furniture and stuff, but then to get the furniture you have to make money, and to make money you have to go do fishing and do gardening and do all these chores for all these people, and like the core of the game starts to be more about doing these kinds of like tasks and chores. And both these games like lean into that. Like I think they make those things fun, but they definitely take away from the kind of like creative experiences of them. And I think it's really telling that for both of these games, and probably lots of others in the same kind of genre, like the players I know who most love these types of games, for example, in The Sims, like I don't know anybody who's loved this game who has not used a cheat code to just give themselves infinite money, or in Animal Crossing, players who basically just game the turnip market so that you basically functionally have infinite money and can then do whatever you want. Like once players actually get to a point where they can do whatever they want in these games, that's when they seem to have the most fun and connect with it the most. So a lot of the kind of like objective setting, designy stuff in these games isn't always working, especially not for like what I would say are the core players, like the people who come back to these games the most. So there is kind of a problem there. And now, gotta warn you, because this is where the kind of hot take portion of this talk is going to be. So, in my opinion, it is a common tendency amongst game designers to try to solve game design problems with game design. Seems kind of obvious, and it's definitely a tendency, a habit that I'm guilty of as well. And that tendency definitely has its strengths, but it also has its weaknesses. I think in all those examples, we're seeing situations where games have kind of a promise of creativity and a promise of kind of player progression, and in all of these cases, when these things come into conflict, the games choose to basically favor the the mathematical, the designy stuff, the collecty stuff, the game mechanical stuff, and they are willing to sacrifice the player's creative freedom or motivation for being creative in order to make kind of the fundamental game aspects as good as they can be. And that's not wrong to solve a problem that way, but it definitely is revealing of what those creators' values are, right? Like which part of the experience they actually value more. And I think something that we're kind of missing here is that, games are more than just game design, right? Players are more than just like moving gears inside a brain. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to look at other aspects of the game to see how we can solve some of these problems in basically different ways. And obviously the aspect that I want to talk about is storytelling and role-playing, and how those things can actually play a role in helping to solve these seemingly unsolvable design problems. So I wanted to look at just a couple examples of games that I think are actually doing really interesting work in this space, that are using storytelling to kind of like solve that problem. And we're going to go kind of in a scale of games that are like more numbers-y, focused and more progressy, to less. And this is just kind of a taste, but maybe you'll get an idea of what I'm kind of talking about here. So like Dungeons and Dragons, great example of a game that that centers the player's creativity so much, right? And this is a game where you can ostensibly be anybody, you can do anything, you can wear anything, you can have whatever name you want, whatever, right? And the numbers of the game are kind of flexible to serve that goal because, ultimately this game is about storytelling and about, playing a role with your friends and being someone else, right? But this game has no lack of opportunity for progression or mastery for a player too, right? Like your characters do have stats, you do get new weapons, you're going to explore, you're going to get your way through the story, you're going to fight stronger monsters, all that kind of stuff. So players definitely have a sense of progression, like linear progression in these games, and growth across them. But they're also very much about the player's creativity and how they can creatively solve problems. So I think this is actually a really interesting study in how player creativity and kind of player progression can be mixed in a fun way. And obviously this is not a video game, so there's certain aspects of this game that are not available to video game designers, but I think it's a really great model to look at for people who are trying to solve that kind of problem. Another really great, very recent example is Disco Elysium. So this is also kind of a role-playing game. In Disco Elysium, you're playing as a detective. You actually have like a huge number of stats that describe basically your character's different aptitudes and attributes at different aspects of like communication and problem solving. And the player makes choices to basically guide the growth of that character in different ways. From a purely kind of like, strictly game design perspective, all that happens in this game is, you're reading text, you're reading story, you're making choices, that change your character's parameters, and all that really ever comes out to is it just opens up different conversations, right? Like the story will go in a different direction, new kind of like lines of dialogue will be available in the conversations that you see, whatever, right? Like that's like really the only thing that changes based on your kind of like choices. And yet, this is a hugely popular game, and I think that all those choices that are available in the game are really meaningful to players. And I think a big part of it is because those choices are rooted in kind of like a narrative context, right? So, players make choices, are encouraged to make choices in this game, not by, or at least often not by like, what do I have to do to win the situation? Because sometimes, like often the answer for that isn't clear. Instead, when players make decisions on Disco Elysium, they're making decisions like, do I want to be this kind of person or do I want to be this kind of person? Do I want to solve this problem this way or this way? And there's no like, qualitative, there's no measure that says like, this is the right answer, this is the wrong answer. It's really about, how do they play the role? Who do they want to be in this world? And making choices in that kind of headspace, I think, encourages players to be creative, right? To make those choices in a more personal, self-expressive kind of way, because they're not always trying to think about how to solve the problem in front of them. They're actually thinking about bigger issues about, who do they want to be, and what is like the right moral principle to guide you through this world. So yeah, I think this game is really, really interesting, and still of course has lots of opportunities for player progression, right? I mean, like I said, the player has stats, and there's a story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end that you want to try to get to. So yeah, there's lots of reward for kind of playing this game and making progress in it. So I'm going to talk about my own games as well, at least a little bit, because this is a space that I've been really interested in. So both Wandersong and Chicory are games that have creativity mechanics in them, but the player's creativity is not like connected to their progression through the game. So there are like puzzle solving experiences and dungeons and action sequences and stuff in both these games that use those creativity mechanics, but a lot of the game is actually about kind of space in just kind of towns and with character interactions. So like a really classic example in both of those games is like, you'll meet a character and they'll say like, oh, like, can you make a song for my candy shop? Or like, can you color in my house and draw with only 10 colors or something? And then players are kind of free to draw whatever they want. And then the characters will like react to that, sometimes in a specific way that's related to what the player chose to do, sometimes not. But in any case, like, the general premise of these games is that they kind of give the player like a setup, and then the player is basically free to make their own punchline to that setup, right? They fill in the blanks with their own creativity, and that creates kind of new story situations where the characters are reacting to something the player did. And so there's kind of opportunities for progression, like by moving through the story and solving like kind of the critical path puzzles and whatever. But then there's also lots of other opportunities for self-expression with kind of the side character interactions. And I think, generally speaking, the goal with a lot of the design of these games is to keep the player in a headspace where they're always thinking about how to be creative, how to express themselves, and how to kind of like play the role of the character in the story, right? Like their creativity is not about, it's not a measure of like, oh, like your picture is good enough that you can advance to the next level, or you filled in enough of this screen that you can advance to the next level, or whatever, right? There's no mechanics like that. It's really about the player kind of deciding how much they want to engage with this stuff and being creative in their own way. And narrative is a lot of the way that we kind of like engage the player with that stuff, right? By having character interactions and whatever. Basically, I think all this is basically to get to the idea that, I think games can really benefit by, taking and like basically changing their objectives, right? Moving away from strict, obvious progression and stat-based things to kind of looking more at like, basically how story and narrative context can be added into these kinds of games to create really interesting opportunities for player creativity. And lots of other things too. Like narrative can encourage all kinds of player behavior that I think are really interesting. In practice, I think what that means is basically like, if you have like hard elements in your game, like stats and numbers, substituting in soft things, and thinking about rewarding the player instead with character interactions and narrative options and whatever, like that stuff can be really interesting for players. Giving a player a foundation to kind of like role play, like saying, hey, like a character is asking for this thing, and how do you respond to that? that's a really open-ended kind of question that players can like be really expressive inside of, and in fact feel encouraged to be expressive inside of. So I think that like story can create lots of really cool opportunities for player creativity. And looking back even bigger, I think what I'm kind of getting at is that I think in general games really can benefit from when like narrative and story designers are given like more opportunities for leadership on these projects, because games that let the story lead where the design goes are gonna basically go in really cool directions that a purely game design driven game is not going to go in. Right now, like indie games are totally ahead of the curve on this because we're working in smaller teams, so often like our director or game designer is also the writer or narrative designer or whatever, right? So people are seeing these overlaps and seeing opportunities to create really cool experiences that combine these ideas. So there are a lot of indie games out there that are doing really cool things with this. And what I'm really hopeful or encouraged by is I just really want to see like AAA studios and larger budget studios kind of like look at what indie games are doing and take some of those ideas and explore that as well, right? But especially like if you're somebody who's exploring design problems and you're interested in creating certain experiences for your player, then I think narrative design there's so much opportunity there for story writers and narrative designers to come in and like really look at how your game design could be spruced up, right, by incorporating some of those ideas into it. So that's my talk. I hope I was clear and interesting. If you want to talk to me about the subject or really anything, you can always reach out to me on Twitter. I'm at Lobanov. This has been great fun. Thank you very much for having me. And I just hope everyone has a great day and keeps making really cool artistic games. Thank you.